Welcome to the New York State Museum, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. Also, thank you to the Albany 250th Commission for helping us bring Dr. Covart. We very much appreciate that. It's wonderful to see such a group gathered to explore New York's rich and complex history. We're especially excited to welcome our speaker for today's program, Revolutionary Crossroads, Albany's strategic role in the fight for independence. Dr. Liz Covart is a historian of the American Revolution who is passionate about making history accessible to all. Many of you may know her as the host of Ben Franklin's World. I'm fangirling today myself, which is an award-winning podcast that brings early American history to life for listeners around the globe. Dr. Covart is also co-founder of the Clio Digital Media and the founder of the History Explorers Club, a vibrant community for lifelong learners. Through her work, Liz has a remarkable ability to connect past and present, helping us see how the people, places, and decisions of the revolutionary era continue to shape our world today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Liz Covart.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back in Albany. I actually lived in this building for like 5 years while I researched and wrote my dissertation. And I used to be upstairs in the New York State Library, which if you haven't had a chance to research there, it's still one of my all-time favorite archives. And the librarians there are amazing. So I would encourage you to take a look and go upstairs. And then, of course, the museum is where I'd come down at lunch and kind of peruse the exhibits. So it's really wonderful to be here. And today I'm excited because a lot of what you're going to hear is research that came out of this very building, which is exciting for me. Does he get water? Before I forget, because I will forget at the end, if you are a fan of the podcast or you think you might like to try out Ben Franklin's World, which is a podcast about early American history, I brought all sorts of bookmarks in the history. So the orange ones are our first bookmarks, and the other black ones are our second, and then the teal ones are our third. So if you're a real super fan, you can collect the set. To understand Albany's role in the Revolution, we really need to understand two important aspects of its history. Between 1688 and 1781, Albany, New York served as the northern headquarters for 4 imperial wars. Why was Albany a headquarters? You didn't really see this here on my picture, but it sits on the Hudson River. As you know, you can see it outside many windows here, but it also sits several miles just below the headwaters of the Mohawk rivers. And when you live in a place that has barely any roads, river travel is a great way to get around. And the fact that big ships could come up from the Atlantic Ocean and be up here 150 miles away into the interior of New York was a big deal, especially because 3 of these wars are Great Britain going to war against the French up in New France, which we now know as Canada. So Albany, New York was a great staging grounds for collecting supplies and collecting troops. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing to know is that most Albanians, and they did call themselves that, not with the, ethnic Albanian with the I, but with the Y, most Albanians chose to side with the revolutionaries and fight for independence because of its promise of equal citizenship and because of the traumatic experiences they experienced at the hands of the British Army during the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, which, despite its 7 Years' War name, took place over 9 years here in North America. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories today. Rather than focus on the familiar stories of Saratoga and the 7 Years' War, I'd like to take you into 2 aspects of these things that you may not know. In 1764, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British military in North America, who would set up his headquarters down the Hudson River in New York City, engaged in a series of negotiations with the city of Albany. You see, during the 7 Years' War, multiple British commanders came in, they seized Albany lots and lands, and they put up military infrastructure. At first, it was a barracks. Then it was a hospital. Then there were a lot of different storehouses and stables to keep the horses and the animals that they needed for the war effort. And when the 7 Years' War ended, well, these buildings were occupying valuable place in a new burgeoning city. So the people of Albany wanted their land back, but the British wanted to own the land. So how this worked is the British actually owned the buildings and the city of Albany owned the land. So Gage, trying to start these negotiations to purchase the land underneath the army's buildings, wrote to Mayor Volkert van Douw. Now, if you know your Albany history, then you know that there is no mayor of Albany named Volkert van Douw. There is a Volkert P. Douw. But I bring up this story because, first, it seems like if you're going to ask for a favor, you probably should get the person's name right before you ask. But the second part is Gage there was a lot of history between the Dutch and the English and a lot of stereotypes. And a lot of Dutch people use van in their surname. It means to or from, or of or from, rather, to denote where their families come from. So a lot of Dutchmen, even here in Albany, would use that surname, but Volkert Douw was not one of them. Let me just keep it up here. Now, although the 7 Years' War lasted 7 years in Europe, like I said, it lasted 9 years here in North America. And during that time, Albany did serve as a command post for the orchestration of British military efforts against Canada. It's really the forward headquarters during the campaign season. Its role started in 1755. Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, he was the first commander of these war efforts, in part because England was still trying to organize itself for war back in England and hadn't really set a commander over yet. So William Shirley takes it upon himself, and he's going to lead a campaign against the French positions at Niagara and Crown Point. So one post way in the west of New York, one post, 100 miles or so from here to the north of Albany. The fact that he's going to have these campaigns brings thousands of men from New York and New England, because these are the men, the militias, and the army that's going to go out on these campaigns. Shirley's campaign in the end was an absolute disaster. It didn't go anywhere because Shirley was trying to organize a new army on the fly, and it didn't work out so well because an army needs lots of supplies, and it needs some order, it needs to be organized, and it just didn't happen in that first campaign season. So the British replaced Shirley. Shirley's replacement was John Campbell, the Earl of Loudon. Now, the people of Albany were initially excited about this, as were other Britons, because Campbell was a serious professional soldier. He had participated in campaigns in Europe, and he had an impressive military record. So if you're someone who's living at the 7 Years' War time period, you're like, this is great. This will be a quick end to the war. So you don't quite know that it's going to be a 7 or 9 years war yet. When Loudon arrived, the people of Albany jubilantly greeted him. They tried to impress him. But the first thing that Loudon did was he went into the Albany Common Council, and in a presentation that didn't allow for any Q&A, unlike what we'll have here today, he basically said, look, I'm coming in, we have a war to fight, and I'm going to do some things that you and your city aren't going to like. And then he walked out the door. The first thing that Loudon did was he tasked a subordinate with conducting a survey of Albany. Loudon believed that Shirley's efforts had largely failed because he couldn't get his campaign out before mid-June. That's pretty late in the campaign season. And when you only have maybe like 2.5 seasons to fight your war, time is critical. What would happen is that men would gather here at Albany, they'd finally go up, and then after the campaign season, Shirley let them all go back home to New York and New England. So they had to remuster for the 1756 campaign season. Loudon saw this as really bad news for the British war effort. He needed to keep his men here in Albany so that they'd be ready to go after winter and immediately launch up into northern New York and Canada. Now, you might recall in 1774, we're going to go to your revolutionary history now. This is just after the Boston Tea Party, and England passes a series of acts called the Coercive Acts. Unless you live here, they're the Intolerable Acts. And they're acts to punish the people of Massachusetts and specifically Boston for their role in the Boston Tea Party. One of those acts was the Quartering Act. Albany is actually a large reason why the Quartering Act was passed. So what Loudon's survey did is he needed room for soldiers. They didn't have a lot of barracks up here that would sustain an army. So he was looking for private house space. Now you have to keep in mind that because there is frontier warfare, people who live on the outskirts of Albany, in places like Scatucoke and Nanticoke, places like Colony, not so much Schenectady because it had its own fort, but places in the northern and western reaches, they're moving into Albany. So a lot of the Albany burghers, citizens of Albany, they had people already living in their outbuildings with tents in their yards. The place of Albany was really full, but Loudon was determined to keep his army here. So he sent a man in to each of the houses in Albany and basically wrote down how many rooms they had and how many soldiers they could fit in the house. Now, traditionally, if you know about British quartering, it's typically officers that are placed in private homes when it has to happen. We'll see this play out during the British occupation of cities during the American Revolution. But in Albany, at the 7 Years' War, it's placing soldiers in the poor people's houses and officers in the more well-to-do. And it means that if you complained, according to Abraham Yates Jr., who will be a future mayor of Albany, if you complain, then Loudon posts more men to billet in your house. So this was a real problem for the people of Albany. Quartering can be it can be a pretty rough experience. Keep in mind, the military in some ways doesn't look all that much different in the 18th century. You have a lot of young officers, boys really in their early 20s, late teens, hanging out in your house. People would say that they did not treat their property nicely, that they kind of treated their personal possessions very roughly. One, I think it was Abraham Yates Jr. actually, who said, yeah, if they could, they would have eaten the furniture. They were just really rough in people's houses. So if you're living there, imagine having ruffians in your houses. They come in at all hours of the night, drunk. They leave at all hours of the day. So you, A, don't feel like you have privacy. B, you're living with noise. C, you're living with people who are kind of like these tenants who are treating your property not so well. So this is a problem for the people of Albany. In fact, Abraham Yates Jr., he keeps a diary. This is why he gets cited so much during this period. He said that the disruptions in people's homes were so much that he actually knew 2 or 3 Albany women who miscarried because of all of the roughness going on in their houses. So this is not a pleasant experience for the people of Albany. Now, why did they quarter in Albany and not elsewhere? If you know the history of the 7 Years' War and even the Revolution, the British always threatened in the 7 Years' War that they would quarter people in private homes, but only in Albany did they actually do it. Philadelphia, New York City, in Charleston, South Carolina, they build barracks, and the army kind of, encamps its army on common areas and what we now consider parks, vacant lands, and empty buildings. But in Albany, these things were already filled up, so they quarter them in private homes. One of the reasons that they were able to do this was necessity. The British Army felt that they really needed to do this to get these campaign seasons off in the way they needed to at the beginning of the campaign seasons to win this war. The other part was the fact that Albany was a little different from every other British colonial city here in North America. And its differentness came from the fact that it was, established as a trading post in 1614, 1615. Yes, it predates New York City. It was also a place where there was still a lot of Dutch flavor. Because keep in mind, you build a house, you're not pulling houses down all the time, even as styles change. You still have a lot of older buildings. And what the city streets in Albany look like is Englishmen preferred to have the wide part of their houses facing the street. And the streets of Albany look more like Amsterdam than London with that regard. They had the narrow part, the gabled end roofs of their house facing out towards the street. They would speak English at this time. Keep in mind that by the time the British come in for the 7 Years' War, these are 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation Americans, North Americans, Britons who are living in North America. They speak English in public settings like this, but then they go home and they speak Dutch. Or they go to the Dutch Reformed Church, which was still the major established church in the city, and they would speak Dutch. And they did this into the 1790s. So while Americans here in Albany were excited that the British would come in as a chance to prove their Britishness, the Britons who came in from elsewhere in the empire consistently treated them like a foreign people. They said it was because, they just couldn't wrap their minds around the fact that the city just did not look British. They heard Dutch, around. They just didn't accept them as Britons. And that was part of the problem. It made it easier for Loudon to not quarter troops in New York and Boston and Philadelphia because he could see those people as Britons, but here he just saw a foreign other. And these are the identity politics that play out during the 7 Years' War, into the Revolution, and even beyond the Revolution that the people of Albany have to deal with. Sorry, my page is not turning. Here we go. So the 7 Years' War ends up being a success for the British. The British end up conquering Canada. It now becomes Canada instead of New France, and Quebec is their main population center there. They're able to do it in part because they were able to launch their campaigns in a speedy way here, and they were able to use Albany as a way to ship their goods up from the Atlantic Ocean. We tend to think, I think, here in North America that most of the British military supplies came from domestic sources here in North America, but the reality is most of them were shipped from Europe. Shipped directly from England and Great Britain. So those ships would cross the Atlantic, they'd land in New York, and then those supplies would come up to Albany via boat, and then they'd be transshipped west and north via the rivers and portages that existed along the Hudson, Champlain, and then the Mohawk River corridors. As you can imagine, when the war ends in the British favor, the people of Albany cannot wait to get the British out of their city. And as you can imagine, it takes the army quite a bit of time to disband. So the war ends in 1763. They don't really officially leave Albany until 1768. And this does not make the people of Albany very happy because they want their land back and they want the British gone. It was just, again, a traumatic experience for all involved of having to quarter and deal with the army in their city in such close proximity. It's really at the end of the 7 Years' War that the Albany story of revolution begins. You've probably heard the standard narrative. If I asked you when did the American Revolution begin, what event would you pick? Lexington and Concord, April 75. Who else? I'm sorry? Ticonderoga, May 1775. No protest acts? Nobody followed the Stamp Act riots in Boston? Philadelphia? But typically, if you crack open a narrative about the revolution, it's going to start around 1765. 1764 with the Sugar Act, if they're feeling ambitious. But it always starts with that story of taxation. Then you hear the story of how in August 1765, the people of Boston revolt against their governor, Thomas Hutchinson. They tear down his house. They threatened Andrew Oliver. They tear down his, they kind of put fire and disassembled Thomas Hutchinson's house, but they physically pulled the boards off Andrew Oliver's dock and his stamp house because he thought he'd be the stamp collector. The people of Albany started rioting in 1764, a full 2 years before those Boston Stamp Act riots happened. So am I saying the revolution started here in Albany? I'm not, but you could. The other thing to know about the taxes, just as a refresher, Great Britain doubled its war debt at a time when you still have this mercantile economic philosophy where all debt is bad. You shouldn't carry debt. You basically set up colonies so you can extract wealth and always have wealth be your thing. They view wealth as finite, and that's part of the reason why they view debt as bad. The people of England are going to be heavily taxed to repay the war. Now, sometimes in North America, we like to say, well, England was taxing us so that it could repay its war debt. That wasn't exactly true. What England was trying to tax the colonies was to raise the revenue for the 10,000 troops that it decided it was going to station here to protect its North American holdings. Where was it going to protect those holdings? Out at Michilimackinac and out towards Detroit in the Great Lakes, down at St. Augustine in Florida, in western posts out near Pittsburgh and other areas. It wasn't in what we would think of as the core 13 colonies of where they were protecting those outposts. So they do try to pass taxes, and that doesn't go over well. But the people of Albany weren't actually protesting against taxes. They were protesting against the British Army's presence in their city and the fact that the army was still disrespecting them. Remember Volkert Van Dow? In 1764 alone, there were 4 riots or mob actions that happened in Albany. In March 1764, two drunken British lieutenants, actually, let me go back to 1763. Sorry, I missed that in my notes. There was one riot in 1763, and Volker P. Dow led it. The Common Council had requested that the British Army remove all of its buildings from Albany. The army refused, so Volkert Van Dal led some Albany people out into the streets, and they started their protests by looking at the army's provision storehouse, which it saw as just this moldering building, and they physically started pulling boards and the fence down around this building. Now, reports say they only got a few boards out before the crowd was dispersed, but the people of Albany were, in a not so subtle way, letting the British know that they wanted the army out. Then in 1764, they followed it up with 4 different riots, both to get the army out and both to show you that there was also still tension and animosity between the people of Albany and the soldiers that were still lingering here in Albany. In March 1764, 2 drunken British lieutenants attempted to seek a drink at a woman's house. The woman did not. She was smart. She didn't open her front doors. They were knocking quite drunkenly. She called out to a neighbor, and the next thing they knew, according to their account, around 200 Albanians came out into the streets and started attacking the soldiers. The soldiers ran back to their barracks. They alerted the grenadiers. These are the tough fighting soldiers. They're physically tall and robust. They get them into the fray. The people of Albany run away, and then they have a street brawl in the street as people filter back in. So that's a serious riot that's happening. Gage decides he's going to quell the riot. He sends Godwin and Goodwin were the 2 lieutenants, and one of them goes out to Fort Niagara, and the other one is transferred to New York City. So he just removes them from the city. In June 1764, the Albany mob showed up again, and this time to tear down the king's stables. Again, this was probably a very stinky place because there were hundreds of animals that had been housed in it. And now that the army didn't house all of those animals, there was no reason to keep it and to keep it stinking up the city. So the people of Albany retaliated by continually posting menacing notices after they were dispersed from trying to tear it down again with their bare hands. So imagine the anger. You're actually going up to a building and ripping your hands into it and pulling off the boards. Then a few weeks later, in late June, early July, the people of Albany attempted to tear down the main guardhouse and artillery building. When the British Army investigated, no one would turn anyone in. So kind of like the Boston Tea Party, right? Where they couldn't find anybody who participated in that event. The same was of this riot in Albany. And then in October 1764, Peter Hansen and Jacob Cowler assaulted a sentry at the King's storehouse after the sentry insulted him. That, in my mind, has linkages to the Boston Massacre and kind of how events went down there. And these were just the attacks in 1764. So you can tell that there's quite a lot of animosity between the people of Albany and the British war, and the British Army. Plus the fact that there was this wartime abuse of soldiers being drunk in town, insulting civilians and making fun of their inherited Dutch culture. People of Albany really want the British out. So the British do evacuate. Engage in 1767, 1768. He's still continuing this negotiation with the Common Council to purchase the land under the building. But the people of Albany won't grant him the land rights. They said, look, these buildings are in the heart of our town. Our population has really grown here because people made a lot of money during the war, so they moved here to Albany. It's really grown here, and we're just not going to sell you the property. And what changed these negotiations is Gage's military budget got slashed. So he said Great Britain's war debt doubles. It's not something they want to carry, so they start slashing the budget in North America, and it's just to keep an establishment of 10,000 troops. So Gage has a lot less resources, and he has to put them out in places like St. Augustine and out near Detroit. So basically, the city of Albany inherits the military buildings. So what did they get? What was their grand prize? They got storehouses, barracks, a hospital, and a fort. What worked out to be okay for the revolutionaries' effort is the people of Albany didn't actually destroy these buildings right away. The British had gone. That seemed to ease things, but I think something we don't understand living in our own current moment is how destructive these wars are, both the 7 Years' War and the revolution that will come after. You have armies trumping through your city, and that takes its toll on infrastructure. You have people coming in and out of your city. So again, a toll on your infrastructure. So things look run down, beat up, moldering, kind of half put together. If there was actual fighting here, then it looked destroyed. And you have to rebuild all of that. So we can see that the city's priorities were actually in rebuilding their docks. For the first time, they built stone docks or quays. They built 3 of them after the 7 Years' War. It wasn't necessarily in getting rid of these buildings, which ended up proving a boon for the revolutionaries' cause. Sorry, I fell behind on my slides. I got really into it. So there's the riots, just so you can see kind of the scale that came down of riots. There's more in 1765, but there's just a couple, so I didn't put them on there. And the British, as I just talked about, they see the infrastructure, and it proved to be a fortunate decision because all the infrastructure the British Army left behind, the Americans would use against them in the Revolution. Now, we've reached a little bit of an interlude. We've now finished the 7 Years' War. You understand that the people of Albany, they've been trying to prove their Britishness throughout, and the British Army and the British personnel that come in, they just don't believe them. They just treat them as foreigners. They disrespect them. And that really rubs the people of Albany the wrong way. So when we think about the revolution, you should have that in the back of your mind, because not only will identity politics continue to play out in the revolution, but I think it also has to do with the fact that Albany, probably statistically, and I didn't have time to run the numbers, but from what I could find from the Committee for the Detecting and Defeating of Conspiracy Minutes, there were 2,075 people brought to the Albany County Sessions for this committee that was designed to root out loyalists. 87 of them were from the Albany city. Rest of them would come from what we now, we don't now know it as Tryon County because he was a royal person. But Tryon County, Charlotte County, which is now part of Vermont. Albany plays a big role in these counties, but only 87 of them came from the city of Albany, and only 26 were confirmed loyalists. That's 1.2%. So you were either doing a really good job of hiding your loyalties, or you were all in on the revolutionary cause, or at least you were in and you weren't doing anything to hinder it. You were occasionally helping. That's probably greater than the homogenous population where they're all British descendants in Boston of being revolutionary. Boston did have quite the sizable loyalist population in the end. So just something to consider. Some people in Albany are going to be very prominently loyalist, including Abraham C. Cowler, the last royally appointed mayor here in Albany. He came from a prominent family of Dutch traders. His elder brother Cornelius ended up signing up and buying a commission in the British Army, and he would stay in the British Army well throughout his career. His elder brother Hendrik took over dad's, profitable fur trade business, and Cowler turned to politics and became mayor of Albany. He would get arrested in Albany for singing, God Save the King on the King's birthday in June. He was exiled from Albany, and he paid the ultimate price for his loyalty. He basically found himself homeless, serving in the militia, serving in occupied New York, and he ended up never being able to move back here. He ended up having to settle in Nova Scotia during the Loyalist diaspora. So not everybody in Albany was a revolutionary. There are prominent examples of loyalists, but on the whole, they have more revolutionary sentiment here than they do in a lot of other places. So Albany and the American Revolution. Like many localities, Albany formed a committee of correspondence after the Virginia House of Burgesses issued its call in 1773 that there should be an intercolonial committee of correspondence. Abraham Yates Jr., again, the future mayor of Albany, he ended up founding the Albany Committee of Correspondence in 1774. There aren't many records in that in the account book. It's both published, so you can borrow it from the library, or the original manuscript is upstairs in special collections. But they do very quickly in 1775 open and become a committee of safety. That just meant they had more robust powers of government, and this is the government that's going to take over for the royal government that's here in Albany. The people of Albany had basically 2 committees of safety. They had one for their city and one for the county, but the county committee did not meet as often as the city committee. And so when the Albany County Sessions was away, the people of Albany ended up making all these decisions and implementing war preparations and carrying out those functions while it was closed. The committee and really the city of Albany had three main projects in 1775. The first, it needed to continue its long historic role in treating with the Haudenosaunee peoples and seeing if they could get the Six Nations at least to remain neutral and not join any sides during the revolution. But if they were determined to join a side, then they were supposed to convince them to join the revolutionary side. That's a fascinating and complicated story and not one I'm going to talk about in the rest of this talk. The second project of the Albany Committee was to assist or at least not stand in the way of the New Englanders' capture of Fort Ticonderoga in May 1775. So we are going to talk about that happening. And thirdly, the formation of the Continental Army in June 1775. The Albany Committee is going to play a really big, important role in helping Philip Schuyler, who had been appointed, he's a son of Albany, famous general. He's been appointed the commander-in-chief of the Northern Department. And the people of Albany have to help him get his army together. And so a lot of their role is going to be this role that they just finished playing in the 7 Years' War, helping to supply the army, playing host to the army as it's on its way to different fronts in northern and western New York. It's also going to serve as a hospital for the wounded that come from the north and campaigns in the west. And it's going to be a pivotal spot, as we know, at the Battle of Saratoga. So just as Albany had in its three earlier wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and the 7 Years' War. Oh, and there was King George's War too, so really five wars of empire. Just as Albany had served as a military headquarters for those northern campaigns, it would serve this function again, as we said, in the Northern Department. Now, what did it mean to be a military headquarters? Like we said, they had to welcome and house and supply the troops as they made their way to the front lines of the Canada Expedition in 1775 and 1776, and then again to Fort Stanwix in Saratoga during the Saratoga campaign season of 1777. The War for Independence saw the people of Albany and the Continental Army turn the despised military hospital, barracks, and storehouses into places the Continental Army could use productively to care for wounded and sick troops, to house soldiers who were on their way to the front, and to accumulate the vast amount of stores and supplies that the Army would need in order to do its campaigns. So really, the Albany Committee of Safety became the Revolutionaries' frontlines government in the Northern Department. So a really important role that it'll play. Now, we had talked about a little bit, we mentioned the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. This is their first project. Just to recap it here, Ethan Allen of the Green Mountain Boys arrived in New York in early May 1775, and he has this goal of capturing Fort Ticonderoga. Not long after Ethan Allen arrived, so did Benedict Arnold. Now, Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold, he's from Connecticut, but he carries a commission from the state of Massachusetts, or the colony. They were still a colony then, but they were thinking very seriously about independence. He carries a commission from Massachusetts, from their provincial congress, with orders to seize cannon at Fort Ticonderoga. Now, the French had built Fort Ticonderoga in 1757, 1758. It was known as Fort Carillon, and it was built during the 7 Years' War. It was not the massive stone fortress that you can visit today. It was actually built first as an earthen and wooden fort work, but the walls were like 4 feet deep. And I was just talking to a historian at Fort Ticonderoga. They've actually blasted cannon at earthen fort works that deep, and I guess it does a really good job of bouncing the cannon away and not destroying things. So there you go. In 1759, the British, after a failed assault in 1758, captured Fort Carillon. They end up storing a lot of supplies there, but then the British military interests shift and they end up building Crown Point, which is on the other side of the river. Well, it's just to the north and to the west of Fort Ticonderoga. The artillery is really important. To give you an idea of how much is there, Henry Knox would walk away with 60 tons of cannon that he would take during his noble train of artillery back to Boston to end the siege of Boston in March 1776, and there were still cannon left over. This is really important. We probably don't think about this, but with the exception of muskets, North Americans do not manufacture their war material. They don't manufacture weapons. If you want a cannon or a mortar or something that heavy, you have to import that from Europe. guess how many mortars and cannons Europe was willing to transport over to North America during this war? Not many, because Great Britain is Great Britain. So Allen and Arnold actually approach the Albany Committee and they seek assistance for the attack. The minutes of the Albany Committee of Safety reveal that the people of Albany were actually really enthusiastic about this plan. They wanted to help. The problem was where Connecticut and Massachusetts had joined into the fray during Lexington and Concord and right after, New York had not made a stance on what it was going to do during this imperial crisis. It hadn't joined the war yet. So if you're in the Albany Committee, are you really going to commit your entire colony to war, or are you going to maybe write to the New York Provincial Congress, which is now the new state government, and seek permission from them before you okay a war? You're going to do that. And so they told Arnold and Allen, like, look, we're not going to hinder you, but we have to seek permission from the Provincial Congress because we cannot commit our colony to war without knowing how the rest of the colony feels about it. But Allen and Arnold left pretty frustrated with that. There had been a lot of stereotypes and tensions and regional rivalry. Think of the Boston Red Sox and New York Yankees rivalry and put it on steroids, because that stuff had been happening into this, from the 17th century forward. They did not trust each other, New Englanders and the people of Albany. And they actually, during periods, actually hated each other. So this was a problem. So Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold will walk away with their traditional New England stereotypes about Albany, saying they're just hesitant, they're cowards, they're not interested in helping at all. But what Albany was trying to do, and what Arnold and Allen never appreciated, was they were trying not to involve their whole colony into war without making sure that the whole colony wanted to be admitted to the war. So what happens is Arnold and Allen actually attack the fort. They see an opportunity, they capture it, and now the Albany Committee is going to have to help them deal with it. In June of 1775, June 15th, you may know that George Washington received his commission from the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, as the commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Philip Schuyler, because each colony, almost state, is going to be allowed 2 men that get appointed generals. Philip Schuyler is one from New York. And Philip Schuyler is appointed the commander-in-chief of the Northern Department. I'm going to go here because I just wanted to show you the hierarchy of government. So there's no federalism at this period, but kind of federalism. You have the Second Continental Congress at the very top, then the individual state/colony provincial congresses, so New York Provincial Congress. Then you'd have the county committee, and then you'd have the city committee. And Arnold and Allen only interacted with the city committee. So they're at the bottom of the food chain in terms of governing bodies. So Philip Schuyler, he's appointed the commander-in-chief of the Northern Department. In January of 1776, that's when Henry Knox and his brother and a secretary arrive from Massachusetts and are like, hey, George Washington has ordered me to collect cannon. Philip Schuyler does his best to help him. Knox has no idea. He's never been to New York before. In fact, he went to New York City earlier to collect some, see what was there for war material that they might be able to send to Massachusetts. And he writes in his diary, says everybody who's ever been to New York City, it's an interesting town and it's quite expensive. So I'm just as happy to leave. So he ends up coming up to Albany afterwards, and Philip Schuyler really digs in and helps him get the supplies he needs. He tells Knox, you don't have to build sledges and sleighs. You don't have to go import animals. The people of New York have them, and this is their business. They're used to the lumber trade. They already have these sleighs and draft horses. Knox was a little perplexed by this because if you know about the New England-New York rivalry, New Englanders have this preference from ox, and the New Yorkers have this preference for the draft horse. But draft horses they had, and they were able to transport 60 tons of cannon down from Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga down to Albany. Then they carried them over the frozen Hudson River, over the Berkshire Mountains, and then once they got over the Berkshire Mountains to around the Springfield area, that's where the New Yorkers dropped them off. So again, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold were frustrated with the people of Albany, but they got the job done. They even went into the Hudson River when one of the cannon, there was only one, but it fell into the river and they hauled it out, and that cannon became known as the Albany.
Where's it now?
I have no idea. So the people of Albany are really showing even in ways that the New Englanders don't recognize as their zeal. They are showing quite zeal for the American cause during the Revolution. The other part that they're really going to play during the Revolution is the job of military supplier. And this is where things get kind of dicey, and this is where the Americans almost lose that pivotal battle of Saratoga. The Northern Department, imagine this. You're George Washington, you're Philip Schuyler, you've just been handed orders. Congratulations, you're now in command of part of the Continental Army. What is the Continental Army? It doesn't exist. You have to create it. So this isn't like the military we have today that has commissary and quartermaster departments and all of the materiel that it needs, or, it's not starting from scratch. These guys were literally in many ways starting from scratch. They had to draft men, get the men to organize into the military. They had to train these men, and they had to get a lot of supplies for them. Fortunately for the Northern Department, Philip Schuyler spent his 7 years war experience working under Colonel John Bradstreet, who was the head procurement officer here in Albany during the war. So Philip Schuyler, very experienced in the quartermaster commissary department. He knows how to get supplies. So Schuyler thinking, hey, I'm in charge of the Northern Department. I'm going to do what so many people in New York would do. I'm going to appoint my nephew, Walter Livingston, to be my subordinate, and he and his cadre of friends are going to help us supply the army. So they go around to New York, farmers and artisans and other places where they need supplies, and they negotiate for these supplies. The way this works a little differently in the Revolutionary period than it does now, if you're in the commissary department, you make bank. Because what happens is for every item that you buy, you get a small percentage as your payment. So if you're accumulating a lot of supplies for the army, and I know a historian just told me in the Revolution for the British weren't allowed to go on campaign until they had like 500,000 pounds of supplies because they, couldn't be away from the seacoast very long. They needed their supplies. You can imagine the feat and how much money some of these commissaries stood to make because of the supplies that they're accumulating. But here's where things get a little dicey. Philip Schuyler and his nephew are going on about their work, but Connecticut, and I really think this isn't really an attack on New Yorkers so much as Connecticut, this is a disorganized period very early on in the war. Connecticut appoints its own commissary, Elisha Phelps, and sends him to Albany to supply the Connecticut troops. Well, this creates problems because Phelps doesn't know the farmers around here, so he's rough with them. He treats them like he's grown up to, really dislike the people of Albany and the surrounding areas, so he treats them accordingly, and he's not very successful in supply. But then he looks at the success that Philip Schuyler and his nephew are having, and Schuyler is not profiting from this because he's the general, but his nephew's profiting and his friends are profiting. And he looks at this and he says, this isn't right. Connecticut gave me a commission. I deserve to be making money from this. This becomes a problem because during all of this, Schuyler is supposed to be launching an invasion of Canada. Now, you may have heard in the last year or so, President Trump saying, yes, we should annex Canada as part of the United States. That's not his idea. The Second Continental Congress had that very idea 250 years ago. It thought, surely the Canadians who have been conquered by the British will want to just throw the British Army out. People of Canada didn't want that. They did not greet the Americans with the open arms that they thought they'd had. And it didn't help the fact that when the Americans get to Canada, they don't necessarily pay for the supplies that they take, and they don't necessarily treat the people there with a whole lot of respect either. So you know this, but Canada does not join the revolution. It is not a state. It was not the 14th state that the Congress imagined it to be. But Philip Schuyler doesn't know this. He's going to launch his campaign into Canada. If you can imagine, if the British Army is not allowed to launch a campaign in the Revolution without 500,000 pounds of supplies, you can imagine that Philip Schuyler, under this training, whatever that number was, he hasn't accumulated it yet, and the army is kind of disorganized, so he doesn't launch the campaign with the haste that the New Englanders and the Second Continental Congress would really like to see. And then Schuyler fell ill. He's 42 years old, which is it's not an elderly age, but it's a little over middle age for the period. He falls ill. So what happens is the campaign gets off to a late start, and Richard Montgomery, his subordinate, ends up leading the campaign. And at first, Montgomery's actually pretty successful with it. Sorry, I'm not very good with these slides. I get very into what I'm talking about. I already told you a little bit about Schuyler and Washington having the same kinds of issues. Only Washington's kind of forgiven for it more than Philip Schuyler, as we'll find out. But here's the Canada campaign. The Canada campaign has two prongs. One goes north from Albany, and then Benedict Arnold is commissioned and sent on a kind of New England going south route, a roundabout way through the Canadian wilderness. And their goal is to link up at Quebec. Basically, Arnold and his campaign is hampered by awful winter weather, disease. They barely make it. There are not a lot of survivors. There's this book, and I forget the title, but it might as well have been like the hell of the wilderness that kept them up. It was just a very harrowing and awful experience. Meanwhile, Montgomery, he's having more luck. The weather holds out a little bit for him. He has river access. Arnold and his men have to physically march through these forested areas. Montgomery and his men use the rivers, and they make their way up the Lake Champlain corridor. They capture Montreal. This looks good. They capture it in November of 1775. But there's pressure to actually make headway. They can't get supplies as they need to from Albany because things are starting to freeze up. And, we've said that there's a lot of confusion in the supply department. So they don't have supplies. So they end up marching to Quebec City to try and capture the city before winter really sets in. But they try to do it around Christmas. And Montgomery falls at Quebec. The Americans don't really make it. A lot of them are captured. Many more of them will make it back down south to Albany and will end up in that military hospital. So that wasn't a great campaign. So Schuyler has one strike against him. The Canada expedition is a failure. The second strike against him will come with the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. But back to the supply issue, because Canada is such a disaster, the New Englanders start trying to apply pressure to get Schuyler out. Who do they want to replace him? Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates was at the evacuation of Boston when the British left. New Englanders feel like he was part of their savior. They want to see him in command, and they argue that New Englanders will serve under him better than they will serve Schuyler. Schuyler is a wealthy patrician. He's a wealthy man. There's hierarchy here in the city of Albany, and he wanted to be like a British aristocrat, and that was what he learned to be during the 7 Years' War. He built his pastures house, which you can visit down the road. He was kind of imperious in some ways, and the New Englanders, who have a little bit more of a leveling attitude, took umbrage to that. So the New Englanders in that respect do have some merit. But where they don't have merit is they accused Schuyler of embezzling money and profiting from the war effort. So Schuyler has to open his books. And the Second Continental Congress, in one of its many side quests, has to try and figure out whether Philip Schuyler basically conducted misconduct. They search through his books. They find out that he didn't. And that ended up working out okay. But it's been a huge distraction. And they're still not able to get all the supplies they need to supply this army in 76 and then again in 1777. So this is a problem. We talked about the squabbling over command. The New Englanders are always going to be angling to get Gates into command. They kind of have like a soft victory in the sense that while Philip Schuyler is technically commander-in-chief of the Northern Department, the Second Continental Army or Congress is convinced to cut Gage an independent command out of Fort Ticonderoga. And now he and Schuyler will be distracted arguing over who has real command of the army and how many men, how this army should be divided as to how many men were under each's command. So things are really distracting here in Albany and New York in the early part of the war. And as you can imagine, this becomes a problem as you're trying to organize for the Battle of Saratoga. As you've probably heard, John Burgoyne, he's a playwright, he's a general, he wants to be the star of the show. And he has this idea that, General William Howe, who took over for General Thomas Gage, he's the commander-in-chief of the army. He finds Howe's methods to not be as aggressive as he would like. So during the winter of 76, early 77, Burgoyne sails back to England and he pitches their equivalent of the Board of War on a plan. Look, like our intelligence says, I firmly believe that if you go south of New York, and really even New York south, the majority of the population is loyalists. They are there to support the crown. But New England is a real problem. It's the head of the snake. And if you cut off the head of the snake, then you kill the snake. And then, basically we'll have all of these other colonies, because I think New England has 4 colonies at the time. So what is that, 9? You'll have 9 colonies secured, and then we can go up and just deal with New England separately. So his pitch for this plan is, I'm going to launch an attack, a 2-pronged assault from Canada. I'm going to take a division of the army south from Montreal and Quebec down into Albany, and I'm going to send a second prong west across Canada because, they don't have to really worry about war there, then down through New York, and then west to cut across Albany, and we'll divide the Continental forces. And then we can have Howe come up and send a contingent from New York City and meet me at Albany, and then we'll have the snake, and we will have lopped off its head. Well, the British, they thought that the war would be over in 75, then they thought it would be over in 76, so they liked Burgoyne's aggressive plan, and they give him permission to do it. So as I said, this is kind of the map. The National Park Service created this one. It really shows the 2 prongs where Burgoyne's going to come down from Canada, and St. Leger, who leads the second prong, the western prong, is going to come out from Canada and then across the Mohawk River Valley. I'm running out of time here because I just got so excited about things. I put it all in my talk. Okay. I just need the page to turn. Okay. So Burgoyne actually launches his assault in mid-June. So he takes a much bigger force down from Canada. Thankfully, he has a lot of riverine and stream access. This means he can carry supplies over on boat. Now keep in mind, Burgoyne knows he's going into the interior. So just like the British commanders along the coast can't leave until they have their 500,000 pounds worth of supplies, it's very similar for Burgoyne. He didn't have that much in his supply train, but he had a huge supply train. So he is able to make quick progress while most of his campaign is down along the river. And they make it to Fort Ticonderoga in late June, early July. And by July 5th, 1777, he has captured Fort Ticonderoga. Now, Fort Ticonderoga didn't really stand a chance. They never had the men that were promised to defend that fortification. A lot of them fell sick to smallpox and to other camp diseases. Like when you read the command books, it's like, please make them wash with soap. Please have them dig the latrines far from camp. But they still get camp sicknesses because none of this seems to really happen. Arthur Sinclair is Schuyler's subordinate up there, and he orders his men to flee. And so the British capture Fort Ticonderoga. That blame for the evacuation of Fort Ticonderoga, the abandonment, falls on Schuyler and the Second Continental Congress and its New England faction, which has part of Virginia in it too. They make a move against Philip Schuyler and remove him from command. Meanwhile, while that politics is happening in the Second Continental Congress, Philip Schuyler is doing all that he can to disrupt Burgoyne's march. So he sends men from here and around Albany, from just along the Hudson River Valley. He has them go up north, chop down trees to block any sort of roads. He has them dam up streams and rivers, mess up portages. They're doing everything they can to throw monkey wrenches into Burgoyne's smooth sailing. And it works because Burgoyne is actually pretty delayed in getting down to what will be Saratoga. Like by Saratoga, he's really supposed to be in Albany, but he never makes it. Meanwhile, Barry St. Leger is taking his men, and he has somewhat smooth sailing across western New York. He pick up Butler's Rangers, which were a bunch of loyalist elite fighters, really, loyalist militia that he leads. They have Seneca and Mohawk warriors that are in their kind of allied army there, and they march across western New York. They make it to Fort Stanwix, where another Albany son, Peter Gansevoort, is there holding the fort. Gansevoort knows he has scouts. The Tuscarora and Oneida had some warriors in his unit. He sends out the scouts, and they get word to the Tryon Committee of Safety and to Nicholas Herkimer that they need relief. They are going to need reinforcement. They need relief, and they're going to need it now because Barry St. Leger and his men and his allied army is coming across the west. Nicholas Herkimer organizes the Tryon County Militia. They march out in relief. The scouts in St. Leger's army hear what's happening. They go out to meet them. And this, on August 6th, is when you get the Battle of Oriskany. This is one of the really violent battles of the Revolution. indigenous warriors especially, that's going to take a heavy toll on them. No one wins this battle. It ends up in a stalemate. Herkimer loses his life. But what it does do is it gives Gansevoort a chance to evacuate a little bit of Fort Stanwix and attack St. Leger's supply lines and attack the camp followers and medical tents that are there, and then go back into Fort Stanwix. So when St. Leger sees the tatters of his army returning, and then he has the fact that his supplies have dwindled, he decides he's not going to make it to Albany, and he and the rest of his force retreat back up to Canada. So in that way, it's kind of a success. You know about the Battle of Saratoga, and we are approaching the end here. Philip Schuyler is removed from command, but Horatio Gates is in command. Burgoyne marches south. He gets to as far as Saratoga, and there he sets up where he's going to meet the provincials, the colonists. He's greatly delayed in getting there, of course, because of all the work. So imagine having fought your way through forest. You're literally building roads, cutting down trees, removing all this stuff that Schuyler has put in your ways. You're fighting the bugs, the black flies, and the mosquitoes. You've been up to the Adirondacks, you know. His army arrives a bit tired, and they're cut off from supplies. They don't have the ability to run north to Canada to get reinforcements from Guy Carleton or supplies. So Burgoyne starts writing to Henry Clinton, really General Howe in New York City, but Howe has already gone to Philadelphia. So Clinton gets the letters, and he says, okay, well, I'm not supposed to send a force, but I guess I could send a force. The British hesitation there means that it does not reach Burgoyne in time, and the Americans win the Battle of Saratoga. This is important. When I told you about the delays of Philip Schuyler, do you know the victory at Saratoga happened because of those delays? We know that the American supply chain was in tatters. We also know that they don't have a lot of weapons. But France had covertly been sending all sorts of weapons, munition, money, uniforms, and ships just weeks before the battle arrive in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Boston. And those supplies are carted off to Saratoga and are sent there to reinforce the Americans. Then Gates does something pretty clever. It's a pretty sad story. I think you've all heard of the scalping of Jane McCrae and her death. Gates turns that into propaganda, and he excites the passions, they say, of the New England and New York troops, and they start flocking in a way that they hadn't been, because morale had been pretty low, to Saratoga to fight in this campaign. So Gates gets the men he needs to do it and the supplies that he needed, because Philip Schuyler and the people of Albany bought him time by putting all those hindrances in Burgoyne's way. After the victory at Saratoga, the war begins to move south. Albany is still going to play a role, kind of like it took the British Army forever to leave the city after the 7 Years' War. It's going to take the Continental Army basically forever to leave Albany after the war shifts south. Albany's hospital till the end of the war is going to be a place where soldiers who were wounded and sick can convalesce. It becomes a safe place because it's now so far from the front. People like Benedict Arnold, who's wounded horribly at Saratoga, he's going to convalesce and recover at Albany. So yes, the other thing to keep in mind is Albany is still going to play a vital part through the end of the war. South Carolina gets all the credit about the viciousness of Americans fighting Americans, loyalists versus revolutionaries, as a civil war. It was just as bad here in New York. There were a lot of divided loyalties. There's going to be a lot of backcountry fighting even after the victory at Yorktown into the early 1780s, and it's really going to take the actual passage by Congress and adoption of the Treaty of Paris to kind of end that fighting. So Albany is going to play a central role in that. And its role as a supply chain is going to continue because now that the war has moved south, farmers actually have the ability to farm. There's the lush farmland around here, and they do start sending supplies south to the effort. So Albany is going to continue a role in the revolution even as the war moves. So just in conclusion here, I'd just like to talk about a few stories about what Albany can teach us. Contrary to what the earliest historians, most of them were New Englanders, what the earliest historians have had to say, the people of Albany were not hesitant to join the revolution. They were in fact very brave, and they worked tirelessly to support the revolutionaries' cause once they had committed to it. They're not lukewarm patriots, as the New Englanders had branded them, and I think we can see this in the statistics. Remember, 1.2%. That's it. Those are the bona fide loyalists that the people of Albany could find. 1.2% of their population are seen as loyalists, and that's even less than the loyalists that you're going to find in a homogenous place where there's not so many different nationalities, happening in a place like Boston. So Boston sees itself as the cradle of liberty, but it did have a loyalist problem, and Albany just never quite did. I'd also like you to take away from this talk the fact that although we view the revolution as this uniting event, I think you can see from the way that the New Englanders and the New Yorkers were squabbling over things like supply and command. The revolution was not a unifying event. In fact, there was a ton of disagreement and regional strife. And while we tend to always focus on loyalist versus revolutionary fighting, and rightfully so, the revolution as a civil war, also contained a lot of regional rivalries. And this is why I'm fascinated by the question. So if you can't get people to join in a union for over, like 150 years before the revolution, why did they decide to get into a perpetual union under the Articles of Confederation? I don't have an answer to that yet, but shotgun wedding there. But you have that where states like New York and New England, the region of New England are fighting with each other. The Army of the Northern Department, while it did accomplish its mission to safeguard the Hudson Valley north of New York City and New England from British capture, we know that this was not a unified force. People did not do this happily. There was still a lot of infighting. The campaigns really suffered from a logistical problem. I don't think that would have changed even if you didn't have regional infighting, but it certainly suffered even more, I think, from the more than centuries worth of regional squabbling and stereotypes that New Englanders and New Yorkers, especially up here in Albany, had with each other. And the almost loss of Saratoga and Albany did not really teach the people of Albany a lesson, nor did their New Englanders derive any lesson from this, because the regional prejudices that would come to bear in the Revolution would continue well into the early Republic until about 1825, when construction of the Erie Canal starts to bring in a large Irish population, and then they turn on the Irish population. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I'm happy to stay a little bit late. I know we're at like 3:03, so thank you. Any questions? Oh, yes.
I'm just trying to understand the distinction between the city of Albany and the county of Albany, because the work I've been doing, there was a lot of loyalist people in the north of Albany, whether it was supported by the Johnson, the Johnson family, or even north at Jessup's Landing and so on, McAlpin around Saratoga Lake. So what I've found is there was a lot of infighting, really, and it wasn't a purely, Saratoga County, let's say, was not a purely loyalist stronghold. There were pockets of both. Whereas I think you're right, the city of Albany was, that's where the 1.2% from. But the outlying areas, it was tough.
Yeah, you're right. In terms of the loyalist populations outside of the city of Albany, in places like Tryon County, which Albany County used to encompass all of northern New York, and then between 1770 and 1773, they start slicing off large swaths and creating new counties. But Albany County is still quite large. But these other counties do have loyalist problems, and so does Albany County. It's far from united, but in the city of Albany, it is pretty unique, and I think because of its experiences with the British Army and so much disrespect, they're like, we don't want to remain part of an empire that doesn't appreciate us as Britons. So they went for a place for more equal citizenship. If you're looking for more on loyalists, I would go through the minutes for the Committee for the Detection and Defeating of Conspiracies in the state of New York. The Albany County Sessions, it's in 2 volumes. And that's what I did, is I just went through and I have this huge spreadsheet of everybody appeared before it. And what you'll find is it's not even a lot of bona fide loyalists, like people you could pin it on. It was like I kind of suspect that it's like neighbors who are having a quarrel with their neighbor. And so to get them back, they just kind of tip off that committee and we're like, yeah, you should look into this guy. And a lot of them are let off on bail to family members and other neighbors. So it's just really tough. And what do? You are trying to unite this populace, especially as the war wages on. It does begin to look like the Americans are going to win their cause and become independent. So how are you going to try and reintegrate people who had been supportive of the other side into New York State? In New York State, there are hard feelings. There is retribution. There are confiscation laws that are pretty heavy after the revolution that go after pretty well-known loyalists. But they do eventually, or they're able to reintegrate neighbors back into their communities. So it is a fascinating and very complicated story. And that's not one you see in New England. So I grew up in New England. I'm a Bostonian, but I very much love the story of New York because it is so rich and so complicated. And there's another question up there.
Yeah, so obviously at the time, New York had a lot of really great and reputable writers. What is it that New England had that allowed them to hold a narrative after the war, to be able to sort of sway the narrative?
I think a large part of it had to do with the fact that the war had left New England in March of 1776. When you think of Boston, now Rhode Island, Newport is an occupied city. There will be incursions into Connecticut, but by and large, it's a pretty safe place where life is allowed to rebuild after their portion in the revolution in a way that it can't rebuild in New York until well after the war is done. So I do think there's like a comfort where you see Mercy Otis Warren, who was one of the first historians, able to write her history. And of course, all these histories are colored by the vantage point that they come from. There's one guy from England who writes a story of the revolution that has some interesting English points of view. Mercy Otis Warren, of course, has a very New England point of view. And then I think it's Preston. I'm always messing up his name. I always forget it. But he's a doctor down in South Carolina, and he has a very Southern point of view. And like the stuff that happens in the North is not as prominent as all the Southern, the nastiness of the Southern campaign. So history, the past is what happened and history is made. And these early historians tried to tell it as a very uniting story. But in also doing so, they couldn't put their own prejudices aside. But they try to tell it as a uniting story because now they're trying to get the United States to be the United States. Yes.
You talked about a lack of harmony, and no question about the lack of harmony between Burgoyne and Howe.
Between Burgoyne and what?
General Howe in the city. If they are not so have such irreconcilable differences, and the third leg of the plan to win the Battle of Saratoga could actually have taken place if Howe doesn't go to Philadelphia, does that change? How do you think that could?
Ooh, the counterfactual. It's like a time warp question on my podcast. I think if Howe had stayed in New York, then it would be really tough. It would be really tough if the British had been able to get more supplies and more men and more ammunition and guns up to the Saratoga area, or even if they had stopped and taken Albany, it would have been hard for the Horatio Gates army to turn around from Saratoga and then try and capture Albany back. So yeah, I actually don't know. I mean, it's a counterfactual, so I don't know, but I'd wager to say that the campaign for Saratoga would be very different, and it would be a very different turning point. Now, historians will point to Saratoga as a turning point because in early 1778, that's when France finally enters the war. I think France was always going to enter the war. France had its butt kicked at the end of the 7 Years' War. It loses Canada. It lost a bunch of Caribbean islands. It lost territory in India, and it's not happy. But their army and navy had been decimated. So by letting the Americans squabble with Great Britain and fight them and engage them and kind of try to exhaust them worked out to the French advantage because in the meantime, they're rebuilding their army and navy. And France in some ways did underestimate the amount of force it would take because if you look at their involvement in the war in 1778 and 1779, and even part of 1780, they only ever send naval support. It's not until late 1780, 1781 that you start to see Rochambeau and military support on the ground troops help the American cause. So I do think France would have entered, but would it have been at that moment? I don't know. Yes.
In that period between the wars, where did the patroon stand on all this, and did he have any influence on the events you described?
Stephen von Rensselaer II, who was the patroon, he was friends with Philip Schuyler. He died very young, so he died before the revolution happened. And after he built that manor house, his wife took care of it, waiting for Stephen von Rensselaer III to come of age. So Stephen von Rensselaer III was just too young to really participate in the revolution, but he does play an active role, of course, in the early republic. Yes.
Do we know where that hospital was in Albany?
So about where the Capitol building is today is about where Fort Frederick was. And Fort Frederick, the English had built that there not long after the second conquest of New York in 1673, because we know about 1664, the English come in, they defeat the British, but then the Dutch come back for a year and New Yorkers welcome them back. And then the Dutch give New York away. So they have Fort Frederick there. So if Fort Frederick's here, I don't remember which direction that we're facing, but it's, I guess, further north because it's like next to the fort, kind of closer to the river, but it's north of here. Yes.
Were you able to find any records for the hospital? And you said Arnold was there.
Yeah, so I apologize. I finished this dissertation 15 years ago, so the facts are not as fresh. But yes, one of the doctors, I think it was one of the New Englanders who came over and he settled in Albany. He liked it a lot. He was a doctor and he basically ran the Albany hospital. He has some correspondence, and then you see some correspondence going down to the basically the chief of the Continental Army hospitals going back and forth. And so there is some information in those records about the Albany hospital. So if I'm recalling correctly, we know that troops were there. We know that Benedict Arnold was there. They complain about supplies a lot because it was the Albany hospital's job to supply the northern reaches. So field hospitals at Crown Point and Ticonderoga and Fort George, on Lake George and some of the other areas. And they really struggle to do that. So that's where the Albany hospital pops up. I never did find somebody had written a book or a dissertation on the hospital. So I don't know how many more records are out there about it, but that's how I came across it. Yes.
I might be able to shed a little light. I've looked at old maps, and if my estimation is correct, the hospital should be about where the Court of Appeals building is, roughly in that area. But you can also see the outline of the fort, particularly by St. Peter's. Back at the Bicentennial, the city outlined the parameters where they believed the fort was with colored markers was red, white, and blue on the street. I happened to notice today, going to church, that the portion by St. Peter's is marked in blue with a little beaver. So I suspect there's a process ongoing, if it has not been completed, to restore that original marking from the 1980s. You may be able to see it as you walk around. The portion I was referring to is right across from the hotel, the Hilton Hotel, and you can see it right there in the sidewalk.
Isn't there a Dutch house that's still standing, or there was a building into the 1900s?
There
on State Street?
There are two that there's a dispute. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm learning.
With your permission, to answer there of course is it's called the English Pub. There's a dispute as to whether that's the oldest house in Albany or the building that Historic Albany owns that is on Hudson Avenue. I can't remember the name of the family that owned it, but it's one of those two. It depends which expert you listen to.
And one of the, just to add on to that, but one of the reasons you don't see a lot of old Dutch architecture left, Albany suffered two severe fires in the early and mid 1790s, and it wiped out a lot of the town. And so that's in the latter part of my dissertation. I did not review for this talk, but if you're interested, there are these fires of Albany, and there's plenty of records about them. If you do need to go, please feel free. No offense, I went over. I'm also happy to continue answering questions. You can come see me privately, but I do want to give you a chance to get out if you're like me and a little reluctant to do that when someone's speaking. And then please be sure you grab some bookmarks. That'd be great.